In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and void, but the Spirit hovered over the darkness, over the deep. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And He saw that it was good. And He separated the light from the dark, and He created the light, and He called the light day and the dark night. And that was day and evening on day one, on the first day. There was something about that just makes my heart jump with joy. I don't know. Maybe it's the nerd in me. Maybe it's just whenever you look at the language, and maybe all that kind of stuff. But there's something that I haven't been able to wrap my mind around ever since I've started studying Scripture at the very beginning. And that was, God has all the power in the universe, infinitely powerful. And when we're kids, we think of Him as just this big mighty guy holding a scepter and just powers and all that kind of stuff that we think about as kids. And why didn't He get His hands dirty on it? We talk about Genesis chapter 1 being the creation account, and everything He created was just simply with His voice. He would speak a word, and the word would form matter. He would say something is good, and that would be the blessing upon it. I always pictured God just like picking up stuff and molding it and doing stuff like that. But God, in His infinite wisdom, spoke, and it came into existence. That, to me, just gets me really excited. Because what it tells us, and it doesn't get me excited just because, it's cool to picture. What it tells us is that from the very beginning, words meant something. It wasn't just, today in our culture, we look at words and it's just like, if I can just say something and it not really mean anything. And it's just a simple thing that I do to kind of fill in space in between lulls in a conversation. A lot of times in our culture, that's what we look at as words. They're just things that fill up space. But in ancient Jewish culture, words didn't only create, but they could also destroy. Look a little bit further in Genesis, and you'll see this interesting story about the serpent. And his words counteracted the words and the promise of God. And these words persuaded Eve and Adam also, and it led to the downfall of our civilization, the downfall of our spirits, and we've just kind of been treading water or coming up from that ever since. So let us not kid ourselves in thinking that words do not mean something. With one word we can create or destroy. And God has given us that ability as well. As people who are made in His image, He has given us the ability to give life or to bring about death with just a word. We see this every day. I remember when I was in when I was in college, I took some voice classes for singing. And one of the things that we talked about was, some theory and music theory. I didn't really get that. It didn't really penetrate my brain very well. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that the professor said was, you can never realize what you do to a person with just your words until much later in their life, sometimes. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes, you hurt. You hurt my feelings, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's you filter something that someone says through a previous experience, and that helps you kind of build, maybe in a negative light or in a positive light. Maybe your parents you grew up in a very healthy household, and you were told you do have worth, you do have value, and so everything after that, even if it was negative, maybe it doesn't affect you as much, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe everything affects you a little bit deeper. So you can create or you can destroy. Now, our professor, he also brought up the idea and the concept of these children who are in junior high, let's say, and they were told that they could not sing. Perhaps God had actually given them the ability and the talent to do it, but it took them a long time to walk into that, to accept that, because that one time when they were in junior high, they were told they can't sing. So we could either be an encouragement life giver or we could be a death bringer. From the very beginning, when we see when God's Spirit was hovering over the darkness, we see this darkness in Jewish culture was meant to give the visual impression of chaos, disorder. They would attribute later on maybe a more evil mentality behind it in some cases, but it's not always what that was. But it was the waters that was that representation. But through that, through the chaos, through the disorder, on top of it, God speaks and things come into existence. So we know if we're made in His image, and He has given us, He has bestowed upon us certain rights and, heirlooms, I guess you might say, of His Spirit and His kindness and His mercy. It means that we also have the power to create just like He did. Now, I know what you're picturing. You're picturing we're going to have this power to say a word and mountains will be built and things like that. I'm not trying to give you that visualization right now. What I'm trying to tell you is that a person's world can be turned upside down with a promise that is broken, or something that happens that is completely contrary to your character. So that is the foundation of this passage that we're about to read here in just a moment. Is that in ancient Jewish culture, and this is the context by which we are reading this wisdom today, words meant something. In fact, they didn't even have a word in their language for obey. They had a word that was Shema. I've talked about this before, but that word literally meant to listen. And the implication was, from hearing those words, you obeyed. Someone of authority, someone of great character and esteem in a particular culture, they would say something and you would say back, I'm listening, or you would acknowledge that I'm listening. The implication was that you would obey that authority. So they didn't really have the word obey, it just was listen. So this is the context by which we're reading today. That there is something about a word or a promise or something that comes out of our mouths that has power, once again, reiterating, to give life or to bring death. So we have this passage here. We think Solomon is writing this book, and he's writing it from the perspective of a teacher or philosopher. And this teacher or philosopher, so to speak, is trying to help us to understand what it means to live in a covenant relationship. And this was a huge theme in ancient Jewish culture, but a covenant relationship with each other and with God Himself. So it's not like, hey, laws, and if you break it, you're going to die. These things that we're talking about today are, what is it going to look like to live in this relationship so that everyone is benefited and everyone thrives? How do we orient our conversations, just friendly conversations with each other? But most importantly, what does our prayer life look like whenever we are promising things to God, or when we are saying, hey, get me out of this jam? We've all done this before. Get me out of this jam, and I will, for you. As if God's like, okay, I was just waiting for you to allow me to do this work in your life. Thank you very much. Now, sometimes we can hinder the Spirit, don't get me wrong. Absolutely we can. But there are other times where we will be so desperate for God to work and for God to fix it, whatever it is that we're going through, that we'll say, God, if you will just take care of this for me, I will follow you. I will do whatever you ask. And I laugh about that because I've done that. And then I think later on, well, why didn't I just do what God asked in the first place? But we have this mentality in our culture of bargaining. Like, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. It's called reciprocity. It's this big fancy word that basically just means you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And we start to treat God like that. And we start to give Him the impression, or we start to have the impression that He's just waiting for us to give Him some great and good gift of our attention or something like that. Then His power can flow through us. Well, like I said, we can hinder the Spirit. But we're just simply called to obey. We're called to listen. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 4 through 7. So if I get there here, okay. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. And do not protest to the temple messenger. My vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, stand in awe of God. Very interesting. When we think of sin, we often think about the dark, the deep back alley, all those kind of things that we normally think about when we think about sin. I mean, when we think about, oh, that person is a very sinful person, none of us, maybe most of us, don't think about what comes out of their mouth. We think about what they're doing in the shadows, what they're doing, like that if their grandma walked in, she'd be appalled. Those kind of things. You know what I'm talking about. I don't have to get too detailed with you. But this is not what this passage is talking about. This passage does say the word sin in it. But this is not what they're talking about. There's almost the implication here, when we look through a lot of other scripture as well, that sin comes in many forms. And while there are no levels, one thing is not more sinful than the other, one thing that we do know is that words matter. Sometimes we disguise prayer requests or we disguise gossip as prayer requests. Well, I know you told me about their problem, but what's their name so I can pray? And then we start sharing it with our friends. Oh, by the way, that's a prayer request, Or perhaps we get to the point where we start talking about other folks, and I talked about this maybe a month ago. It's this concept called Lashon Hara. And if you remember when we talked about it, great. If not, I'll tell you again. It's this concept of you're trying to make someone else think less of another person, whether it be through a lie or even through the truth. So maybe you're lying about someone, saying, oh, they're the worst person ever, that I think they might be a serial killer, that kind of thing. And you're trying to get someone to think negatively about them through a lie. But then there's this other thing. Well, oh, you should have heard what they told me was going on in their life. I mean, I'm not one to gossip. And that, by the way, that's always the intro to you gossiping. I'm not one to gossip. I'm not one to gossip, but they did tell me that, so on and so forth, X, Y, Z. And it's the truth that happened. They told you that, and there's no dishonesty here, but you're saying it so that you can make that other person dislike or discredit that person. what we do with our words is not only we just say things and God's like, hey man, come on, don't do that. That's not only what we're doing, we're actually trying to steal people's humanity. The image of God. We're trying to take that away from them. And that was our very first gift ever from God Himself. So that's part of the words that we're talking about. But this particular passage is not necessarily even talking about that. This passage is meant to talk about those times in which we are in desperate situations and we're calling out to God and we say, I will do anything for you, Lord, if you just fix this for me. Like we talked about a little while ago. Those are the kind of vows that this is talking about. Also, the kind of vows it's talking about, and they believe that these kind of vows were vows directly given to God, were like relationship contracts, whether it be marriage, whether it be, our property lines need to overlap and we need to figure this out. Those kind of words as well. We are standing in front of God. We are making a pledge to live in community with one another in whatever context it is. And I secretly, in the back of my mind, kind of have a plan to break this covenant. Maybe not, but if it benefits me. So this passage is saying, do not make a vow to God just to break it. Don't step into a covenant relationship, whether it be with your neighbor, whether it be within a business transaction, whether it be marriage, whatever it is whatever the case is. Don't just step into it with the intention of kind of leaving some slack just in case. No. This passage is not only about. And let me just point this out. Whenever you see the word fool in Scripture, usually it is not talking about a heaven or hell issue. Does that make sense? It's not saying like, hey, if you break this promise, like if me and Sean are in a business transaction and I kind of fudge the numbers over here, I'm not going to hell for that, but our relationship is broken. So I want to make sure we understand that I'm a fool in that particular context. So I want to say that real quick. God is talking about what it means, and the author is talking about what it means to live a successful life in the context of community. So that's one part. And if our community is God-centered, and we love one another, and we love God, and He is the first and foremost, He is the beginning and the end, and we worship Him, and we are all people made in His image, and we are all people that follow Him, and we love Him with all of our hearts, and all of that kind of stuff, then it means that a vow from me to you is a vow, and with sincerity, with the intention of making each other better, lifting each other up, ending suffering between you and I. It means that this is not only a vow between you and me, but this is a vow between me and God as well. Because we're doing God's stuff at that point. Does that all make sense? So when we make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. If it was important enough to make a promise about it, then hop on it. That's what the passage is saying. If you've already given your heart and mind to benefiting someone and to living in community and to living in a covenantal relationship, then it is your responsibility to make sure that it has come to fruition. So when you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. When you tell God that you're going to do something, when you promise Him, do it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. How many of us have made promises that we knew that we couldn't? Whether it be to your spouse or whether it be to a best friend, you knew you weren't going to be there. You knew you weren't going to show up. You knew you weren't going to do that. And maybe you had the best intentions. Because you wanted to make them in the moment feel better. You wanted to be polite. You wanted to... No, God is actually refuting that. That whole mentality. If you can't do it, say you can't do it. If you can do it, put your whole heart into it. If you say you love God, and you've promised Him something, don't delay in doing it. So, now that's easy for me to say. But sometimes this promise comes in the form of a calling to ministry or something. So in this case, I might be a little bit hypocritical. Like I told God when I was 13, oh, you can have me, Lord. You can, whatever you want to do, whatever ministry you want me to go into, as long as it's youth ministry, that's fine. And Debbie's like, no. I'll give you parameters, but as long as you stay within those parameters, it's going to be great. This is going to be great. So for me, in my context, I went through from the age 13 to whatever the age it was that I eventually became a lead pastor. But I was telling God what He needed to do. Like, well, Lord, you've called me to youth ministry. You have blessed me with certain gifts and abilities, and why is it I'm not feeling fulfilled, full, complete? And Lord, there's this conviction between me and God that I felt like I was keeping something from Him, like I wasn't allowing Him to do something through me, as if I was blocking something. And I told God He could have me all He wants, But there was that space in my life that was off limits. Ministry's great. Hey, that's godly. And people look at me like, oh, he's a Christian. He's a great guy. Well, maybe I just need to study the Bible more. So I did. And as time went by, there was this nagging in my spirit that I couldn't deny it. I couldn't get away from it. I couldn't sidestep it. I just couldn't do it anymore. And I even considered the fact that I might not be called to ministry at all if I'm feeling like this. Because if I am, I'm obviously called to youth ministry. But if I'm not, then I need to do something else. So I continued to be a youth pastor, and then God gave me a clear calling to start a church. I said, well, God, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about if I become a part of a church plant. That's fine. I'll let you do that. That's great. That's supposed to be funny. But I'll let you work in that way through me. That's fine. So there were a couple times where I went to some meetings, met with some district superintendents, and hey, there's this church that's starting. You should be a part of it. And I thought, that still doesn't feel like what I'm supposed to do. So fast forward, finally I get to the point where I'm in youth ministry, and I cannot think of another thing to teach. God will not allow me to have this inspiration to do this stuff for youth group and all these kind of things. And it's as if God took a syringe and just took out my very passion for what I was doing. Now, people were getting saved and people were getting sanctified, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Great. And that's the way I felt. And then I started to kind of inch closer to God as if to say, well, if this is not what you want, what do you want? Because I know I'm called to ministry, but it's obviously youth ministry, but what is it you want? I'll do anything you ask me to do in youth ministry, that's fine. But then I felt God almost pivoting me in a way. Saying, no, you're looking at it all wrong. You told me what I felt like God was saying. You told me when you were 13 that I had all of you. And I know you were young and you didn't know what that meant. But do I? Are you just going to make a vow and not fulfill it? Are we just going to go through the motions, or are we going to get serious here? So, at that point, it's kind of when I felt like God was calling me personally to the senior pastoral role. And when I stepped into that role, God began to renew my passion, began to renew my inspiration, began to fill my head with thoughts and things like that. I'm telling you that there was a definite cutoff between the time that I stopped disobeying and the time that I started to obey. There was a distinct difference. I was still going to heaven when I was youth pastor. Okay? But at that point, when I completely surrendered, it was like there was a different person walking through the door. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew he already knew how to do it. So I tell you all of that to say this. If you have made a vow to God, don't delay fulfilling it. If you've truly given your life to Jesus, okay, I'll say it. If you've truly given your life to Jesus, quit messing around. That's when I furrow the brow and really look at you like I'm serious, okay? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? And I'll say it again. If you've truly given your life to Jesus, quit messing around. Because from the time you take that next step into obedience, your life is going to be completely different. You're going to have fulfillment like you've never had. In our particular theological heritage, we call this surrender sanctification. It's this big fancy word for I have given myself fully to Him. So, I feel like when I read something like that, even though it's Old Testament, and the word sanctification kind of feels New Testament-y, that, yeah, that's a new word I just made up. Even though this is Old Testament, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about not only using your words to declare things, but backing it up with action. We can say words all day. And being in the full-time position that I am at work, I do say words all day. And sometimes for me, it's the same words over and over. Like, you want to know about this particular program? I'll tell you about this program. I'll tell you how many credits you need in order to get into school. I'll tell you, what the difference between this kind of school and this kind of school. I'll tell you all these things, and it's verbatim from the last conversation 10 minutes ago. But in a way, while it has meaning, it can help people through, is it transformational? We have the power to create life in someone's heart who is currently experiencing death. So that's the human interaction. We also have the power to step into a brand new life with the fulfillment of something that we have said to God. So if you come to the altar and you said, Lord, you have all of me, and you walk home, or you walk back to your seat, and you go home unchanged, quit messing around. I'm not trying to be legalistic or anything like that. I'm just trying to give you a word of the Lord. So where are you at in your life? Maybe You have given that vow a long time ago. Maybe it's in the context of ministry or something specific, and you've been kind of too scared because you're like, I just don't feel like I can do that. Well, you can't. So I'm not going to be a downer, but you can't. Only God can do that through you if you completely give yourself to Him. And you're going to go through day after day after day, discouragement, encouragement, support. You feel like you're all alone, and all of these kind of things. And that's fine, because that's the human experience. But never let that distract you from the laser focus that we're called to have on His mission. This life is much more than just going from one pleasurable experience to the next pleasurable experience. Oh, I'm going to offend a lot of people here today. This is going to be awesome. Or as our culture calls it, living your best life. You know what your best life is? Fully centered in God. Like you won't believe it. Now, I'm not going to say it's all going to be all roses and sunshine. There's going to be suffering. There's going to be discouragement. There's going to be things that happen in which you're like, oh, is He even here? Is He even listening? You're like, well, why, Lord? Why did you do this? Why did you allow this to happen? That is all going to be present, so get ready. But what I'm saying is, that stuff is also in a time in which you did not follow God. But now it's going to be transformative. It's going to be a growing factor. You're going to be able to look back at your life, and I said, I remember whenever I told God I would do that, and look where I am now. And your testimony flows from that. If you have some business to do with God today, I invite you to do so. This front of the stage here, we kind of use as an altar. If you'd like to come and you'd like to kneel at the altar, that is great.